What do you say to Rand Paul? You're having a hard time tonight. Classic Trump one-liners. And so weirdly enough, like at the time, I didn't think of this as like being a weird, any relevant to me at all. But I think Justin, everyone who's been in academia at this period realizes this was like a weird, like everything just went haywire. And so when I arrived in Arizona, I wasn't just arriving in a more bureaucratic department or something like that. I was arriving in like a kind of a weird inquisition. That's the only way I can describe it. It was kind of like a lot of departments, like, you know, we are far past the day of like even pretending to dispassionately study things. I think we've really degenerated. You know, this isn't even to say that I think that that's not an ideal that we can reach, but you know, things. It was like working as a janitor in a cult. That's how I described it to people. Where it's like everyone there, like they know that you're not really a member of the cult, and they know that there's a reason you're there. But it's like kind of weird interacting with them, and they can always kind of sniff you out. I was not like at the time. I never talked about politics. I mean, frankly, I was kind of like maybe libertarian leaning leftist kind of guy. But like, I think for a lot of people, I mean, this is you know, I had read earlier in my life some of the kind of Curtis Yarvin stuff, who have these views of the bureaucracy and the university system. But it was only around then things started like clicking, like, oh, like I understand like the kind of social nature and the systemic nature for the things that are going on in academia. And so that, weirdly enough, so yeah, Donald Trump was like a weirdly, not influential on me, but influential on the circumstances, because you realize the kind of crazy world you're living in.
Yeah, if people don't remember at that time, many of you I'm sure do remember, like generally in every institutional context, things just got crazy. Like people got crazy. Like don't they call it Trump derangement syndrome? Is a meme that was real. Like during those years, everyone seemed to get weirdly crazy, and the atmosphere or the mood in especially these kind of left-leaning bureaucratic contexts got really, really kind of wild. So like, and how did it manifest? Like what was your experience like?
You know, it's not the thing is it's. Firstly, it starts as a feeling. You kind of get this conspiratorial, you know, feeling about things, and I think, I mean, you know, I don't want to name names or anything like that, but there was a small group of graduate students who were agitating against me, not because, you know, again, I wasn't a political person at the time, and I don't consider myself a political person now.
You were making YouTube videos, but they were
no, I wasn't.
Oh,
no,
okay.
This started much later. Okay, so I started. You know, we were talking before this started. I think there's a sense in which also, like, the system is naturally, I guess, suspicious of people who have any kind of stern opinions, any kind of principled not even opposition, but I think who have a little too much testosterone in their system and might be liable to criticize you, even if they don't disagree with you.
Yeah,
even
they can just tell you're not going to fall in line.
Right.
So you're a problem.
And that's kind of how it started for me. I think, you know, it's weird. I don't know. The Arizona stuff is interesting, but and there are a lot of details with. Also, you know, this was a period where the witch hunts were happening for all of these people. Not just, of course, no one in my department supported Trump, right? I mean, eventually I did, but it was more like because of my exposure to this, like you kind of see the psychosis of the system, and you actually realize, you know, what Trump was about. You know, it's not about some specific policy thing or something like that. But the thing about leftists, the thing about like institutionalized leftists is that like they might be saying crazy things, but they can definitely detect threats very well. And I think whatever you say about Trump's politics, there was this sense in which he is extremely dangerous for the kind of the background radiation of like the smug institutional leftism and like this mightier than thou kind of mindset, I guess. And like he was just unabashedly against this, absolutely lampooned the American political structure. And so that's why, you know, one of the reasons that, you know, things were just nuts, you know, in academia at this point. And, you know, anything can snowball into things getting more crazy. You know, and it also, at other times, I remember, you know, one other thing that was going through my head at the time is it was getting to the point, most departments, right, at least at the time, I think it's probably gotten worse now, but I would estimate like you probably have like 10% of a lot of these departments that are just like hardcore, stereotypical SJW types, right? That people always make fun of. And then the rest are like, they're left leaning. And they might even have like strong principles of like, old school free speech kind of guys. And that was the case at Arizona. But when push comes to shove, that 10%, everyone else is going to acquiesce to them. It's one of those, tyranny of the minority kind of things. And that's definitely how it was at Arizona. There were a lot of people in charge, a lot of professors in charge who frankly, I think felt kind of like they had to acquiesce to a very small number of students that were forcing this kind of stuff on them. And it was really common, actually. I remember one event, I don't want to give too much away, but, my advisor there, who's Tom Bever. He's famous in the field. I don't know if anyone's heard of him, but there's one point where someone had sent out some email on the listserv about transgenderism or something like that. And Tom, of course, he's an old man. He's not, now he's he has impeccable political credentials, right? In terms of like, I don't know, in terms of what you're supposed to be as a professor. In fact, back in the day, actually, I didn't learn this till after I left Arizona, but he actually appeared on Bill Buckley's, firing line? Is that what it's called? He was debating against, who is it, like Richard Herrnstein, the guy who wrote The Bell Curve with Charles Murray, right? So, of course, he was taking the, IQ isn't biological or more. You can look it up. It's on YouTube. He has this ridiculous mustache. Either way, there was this time where he responded to something about transgenderism on the listserv or something, and he just got publicly chewed out by this graduate student, this like snot-nosed graduate student, just like berated him for like email after email, just in front of everyone. It's one of those things, and it just made me think like here is this guy who's like extremely accomplished in his field, and like he's achieved so much in this system, and he even is like politically, perfect in all the senses you're supposed to be if you're a member of the intelligentsia. And here he is getting chewed out by this like bratty girl, who it was just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like, if I persist in the system is one of the things.
Okay, so you're seeing things like this happening, right? And in your case, like let's fast forward a little bit to when you're starting to think about like, oh man, maybe I got to book it.
Right. I kind of think we should go back before Arizona, right? Because I think maybe we talked about this yesterday, but I think there's a sense in which every academics don't do anything. Like I mean, most of them like they don't really accomplish things. And there's this mindset in your brain. You always have to be like, okay, the money that I'm getting is somehow justified, right? And I think this is something I had struggled with for a long time. Before I went into grad school for linguistics, I was actually in economics, and this was a big concern. And you have to puff up the field you're in to, megalomaniacal, proportions to justify you doing it sometimes and receiving state money and stuff like that. And so I think, I think the first thing is, am I actually contributing to the world in a meaningful sense? Like, is this Rube Goldberg machine where we're funding people to do like very insular research or like even theory internal research? Is that something that's actually even meaningful in the first place? So I think this wasn't, I didn't leave academia because of, crazy liberals. I actually thank those people because it really, they're kind of a symptom of a deeper problem. That's what I perceive. Like, I don't hold it against any of those people. Anyone who has seriously wronged me, I will happily forgive them. And I don't hold it against them, but I do think that it's more. This is just it only happens because there are deeper problems.
Okay, that's interesting. You say you would thank them. So, like, what did they teach you? What did they force you to realize sooner than you might have?
What did they teach me? I don't know.
What do you thank them for?
It's more like, you can't be too mad when someone is using the system for their own enjoyment, right? It's not really their problem. It can be a very morally wrong thing to do that. But ultimately, I think the issue is not the people themselves. It's, the structure of academia and what actually is going on. So, but anyway, before this, of course, I had. I think starting out in economics, right? So just to give a background on that, when I was a kid, I suppose we'll start at the beginning. When I was in high school, right? the first way I got into linguistics is I started learning Latin and Greek and stuff like this. And this was just something I personally studied. I just kind of randomly found a Latin book one day, found it really interesting. I would skip class in high school and run to the library and like read like this commentary on the Bible and stuff like that. It's just like whatever I wanted. And then when I went into when I went to do my bachelor's degree, right? So I decided on economics mainly because I thought it was a field that was like kind of interesting, and it touched the real world, at least in my mind. But it was also kind of at least in my view at the period, it was a way of making politics kind of scientific, right? And I think a lot of academic disciplines, economics is definitely a perfect example, where the entire epistemology of it is based on what is most convenient for people to preach to others, right? So economics is like one of these fields where like if you want to offend an economist, just call economics a pseudoscience. Like that's something they very much have like physics envy about all this kind of stuff. And it was one of the first times in my life when I had to grapple with, okay, so what does it mean to actually have like a theory? What does it mean for it to, correspond to the world in some way? Like how can, like, is aggregate supply actually a thing?
So let's talk about this. Let's talk about scientific method, because
Right.
you're well trained and you know these debates, and I believe that you're into Feyerabend and epistemological anarchism.
Right.
So talk about that. Like talk about what is epistemological anarchism and why do you subscribe to that
Well,
view?
epistemological anarchism is just like the normal way of looking at science in all times and places. That's my
So
actual
kind of
view.
summarize it for people.
So I mean, I guess we should summarize it by explaining the opposite of that. Okay. So normally how things work nowadays, I'll make kind of a meta argument, an institutional argument. So the United States government more or less decides how to give us money in academia based on the peer review system now. This is a relatively recent invention within the 20th century. Now, people did peer review before, but it was something like very public, right? You publish something and then someone like judges it, right? Now, all of that part is done privately, in journals, and then you publish stuff, and then they can talk about it. But it's all approved by basically the field beforehand. So the reason this is important is because that is often the metric of how people get funding, right? So what that means, like the institutional incentive that provides for academics is pretty clear. You want to rule out everyone else who's not a part of your party by virtue of them not being fit for science, right? So in the case of linguistics, right, there are actually a couple different linguistic frameworks you can say. Linguistics, weirdly enough, I have a lot of bad things to say about it, but one good thing that you can say is that it's kind of polycentric at this point, and that's kind of an accident. Maybe a couple decades ago it was all Chomsky stuff, but now there's a bunch of different pockets, right? But in general, each of these frameworks will try to, get their buddies funding and exclude everyone else by default. And what this creates is an environment where people aren't necessarily like disproving each other's theories. They're more like just trying to say, well, they're not real science. So like Chomsky will be like, well, if you do too much statistics in language, that's really like butterfly collecting. That's the word he likes, the expression he likes. Like it's, you got to think about core principles. You can't look too much at data. That's a little hefty, right? You don't actually want to do that.
Basically, it creates all of these turf wars over like what is allowed, basically.
Right. Yeah. So epistemological anarchism would be kind of the opposite, where it's more one of those let a thousand schools bloom kind of thing. And I think although you can look at the history of science and you can see a whole lot of schools of thought and things like this, but there was never really like, Stoic philosophers didn't want to say, oh, all the other philosophers, they should just like not even be considered. I'm sure individual people might say that, but now there's very much like this institutional side of it that, and this is one of the reasons actually I think that science in nearly every field has kind of become calcified in the 20th century, right? So in linguistics, Chomsky is the pioneer of this. Like Chomsky is an effective figure, not because like his ideas are so great and people we were talking before, right? A lot of linguists, they look at like Noam Chomsky's contributions and they're like kind of confused by his writing, and like it's like opaque, and like they're not even clear. Like what really is generative linguistics? What really is universal grammar, right? Those terms, they sound like they mean something, but when you really get deep at it, it's kind of ambiguous. And you look at other fields like economics and where Keynesianism, this kind of neoclassical Keynesianism is now the norm, or even frankly Einsteinian physics, right? And you see in the 20th century as this peer review system, as this metric of funding different academic disciplines became more common, you kind of feel this slowdown, or I don't even want to say slowdown, but there's this kind of stagnation in that there's one way that we can look at things in each of these fields, and that's basically it. One of the things about this is just. Now, this is not me saying, oh, I love diversity for diversity's sake or anything like that. But I think foundationally, you have to understand that like human reason is not fit to understand the world in a very simple sense. And I think that the use of different theoretical frameworks is that by their own nature, they can clue you in by their underlying structure to different, just like fundamentally, you will find data problems you wouldn't find in other cases. Or I think a better way of putting it is that actual scientific progress, if you want to use that term, it's very, iffy, is having better and better phenomenology. And what I mean by that is like not developing better theories or like better equations, but phenomenology would be like relating, the fact that, this happens in an economy causes prices to increase or decrease, like a kind of, that's in the case of economics, but phenomenology, increasing or improving your phenomenology would basically be finding out new things about the world, okay, to put it in a very simple sense. And in that sense, like I think mainstream science in many different disciplines is actually very bad at doing that. And when they do it, they do it in very rarefied circumstances. Most scientific disciplines, I really think at this point, are solving, this is 100% the case in linguistics, in generative linguistics, they're mostly solving theory internal problems that don't even make sense when you try to explain them to your grandma at, Thanksgiving.
So let me ask you this. So you're going through your PhD program and you're kind of in this Trump deranged context where you didn't do anything wrong. There's no accusations against you. You just kind of feel like ambiently the things are closing in on you and things feel inhospitable and things feel like your potential is feeling to you foreclosed. To walk us through, like, how do you think about the decision to like, I gotta pick up and go. I need to pursue a different life path. But I want you to tie it into this question of epistemology. I want you to tie this into the question of like, how do we know what we know? Like, if you feel that you should do something, or you feel that something else somewhere else would be better, a different path would be better, how do you evaluate that critically and independently? How do you decide, this other leap is the true leap that I should take for myself? How do you think about that as a kind of inferential question? How do you know that a different path is the true path?
Well, I don't know if it's a question of epistemology, but I'll say, the reason I said that I'm thankful to people who might have witch hunted me, not even to accuse them of anything, but the reason I'm thankful for that is I think they really encourage, like by depriving me of this one path, or by making it more difficult, it made it easier to do the thing that in my heart of hearts, I knew was the right thing to do, right? And that meant cutting my losses, leaving academia, and like pursuing a life where I can be more personally independent, and things like this, right? That I think is. That's why when these bad things happen, you have to be very thankful. And the reason they happen it's not just like magic. It's because like when you're in a corrupt system, it does corrupt things.
And so in the second half of your grad school career, you did start doing more YouTube videos, right?
Yeah. Eventually I did. It was, well, really I started it as kind of an outlet. Like I was kind of bored. I think I was learning LaTeX at the time, and I decided to like put up some LaTeX tutorials to like help my friends or whatever. So I started doing that kind of nervously, and I started like doing at that point it was nearly all technology stuff and simple stuff. It wasn't until really I left academia that I started doing things that were more like lifestyle-y, I could speak more freely.
Did your work on YouTube affect your decision to leave academia? Like, were you kind of feeling like, oh, there's this whole other world out there and people are paying attention to what I'm saying? I could just do this instead.
Sure. I mean, I told you beforehand that there's a point where I realized, okay, I was a very small channel back then, but I was like, I get way more views on YouTube than students I will ever have in class. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so you kind of realize, however well paid an academic may be, your influence on the world is actually pretty minimal. Like maybe like you're part of this like Lovecraftian beast that it like has an effect on the world. But as an individual, you don't really have that much unless you're just like the alpha of your particular field. Mm-hmm. So it made me more intransigent, I think. And that's why as time went on, like I pretty quickly was like, okay, yeah, this is not going to be for me. Maybe that made me more, abrasive. But again, like I was never confrontational with people in graduate school. It's not like, I'm not like a hothead. I'm like very much the opposite of a hothead. If anything, it was like me sitting silently and them knowing that I thought they were idiots.
So the YouTube channel did kind of make you feel like, okay, there are these other
right.
opportunities to build a life where, I can express ideas, develop ideas, share ideas, and have some level of influence. Yeah,
that's definitely true. But I will say that I think the end goal is, YouTube is not a real job either. I mean, that's just a fact of life. Like, I think the real thing is, getting back to all right, let me change. I'm not changing subject.
Sure.
But, I remember when I was a teenager, right? I was reading about like Chinese philosophy, and there's a point where the philosopher Zhuangzi, he's an interesting guy, but he has this point in one of his writings where he says like, what is the ideal life, right? And if you're a kid who's a megalomaniac or something, or you want to have like this kind of massive effect on the world, delusions of grandeur, right? Which I probably was as a teenager, and even as I grew up, like you want to be the best, like you want to kind of work within the system, work up the system, right? But Zhuangzi says, well, what is the ideal life, right? And I heard this first when I was a teenager, and he says, well, the ideal life is this, right? So you live in a small village. Okay, you live around family and friends, and you have everything you need, you have everything you want. And then sometimes if you go on a stroll, you can walk out, at the edge of the village, and if you listen really hard, you can hear the chickens from the village next to you. But never in your life you actually feel like you ever need to go to that village. And you might forever be in the village you came up in, right? And I think that's really the ideal. And I'm not just saying like at an individual level, but I think that the world, there's a natural, like human psychology is built to survive in that world. It is not built to survive in the world of academia. Okay, this is something that is a historical accident coming from medieval monasteries or classical schools and things like this. Nor is having a YouTube channel, obviously, because that is a weird like parasocial thing. All of these things you have to look at it as being like temporary, and like the only thing that I think humans are ever really going to enjoy is the environment they've been created in or evolved in, if you prefer, right? That's what our psychology is for.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because so now you live in rural Florida. You have a very independent lifestyle.
So you say things like you have an independent lifestyle. Oh, you have a weird lifestyle. Well, I'm not saying that, but like I want to be clear. What I'm advocating for people is a return to normalcy. Okay, that's really what it is. Or you can call it exit. Whatever meme words people like. We're exiting those institutions and we're returning to normalcy. Like that's really the goal. And the thing about this is when people are plugged into the system, we got to win elections. We got to do this, that, and the other. I have to be a part of this. If you just kind of unplug from it, you realize, oh, I actually have a massive amount of control over my life. I can be a big deal in my community. I can have a lot of effect on the world and my family and all this kind of stuff. So I definitely don't want to independence is like it's the norm in all times and places. And even 100 years ago, it was perfectly normal. Everyone was a doomsday prepper back then, right? Everyone kept as much food as they could to survive the winter and more. Like that's just normal. And so I want to be clear, I'm not endorsing like a meme lifestyle. I'm endorsing like the human lifestyle.
Totally. That's a great point.
Sorry to nitpick that. Like,
no,
one
it's very
word
good.
You said.
No, it's very good. And to be clear, before when I said weird, I was more referring to myself than you.
Totally,
but yeah.
Okay.
This is awesome. Let's unpack this, because the reason this is so interesting is that you're right. You're just returning to normalcy, but very few people who have a go at a kind of more cosmopolitan, highly educated, high status career path, very few of them actually make the transition back to normalcy successfully.
Well, because it's comforting.
Well, this is what you have some alpha on, and this is what you are kind of unique and impressive on. There are not many people who, do a PhD program. They're, rubbing elbows with Chomsky. Their advisor is saying that they're going to be the next Chomsky. There's not many people like that who kind of look at it. They're kind of like, this is a sinking ship, and it's also corrupt and awful, and I'm going to go live a normal life in rural Florida. So let's unpack that. That's what I want to understand, like how you think about that, because a lot of people can't make that transition. Like a lot of people, once they're kind of, they're trying to get a PhD, they're living in a big city, they have all these aspirations.
Well,
it's like,
you have
how
to,
do you uncut from that?
You have to pray for bad things to happen in your life. Okay, that's the real thing, because that's what happened to me. The decision became a lot easier when you feel the pressure, like, oh, I don't know. I mean, well, okay, so I told you this before we started about the thing with my qualifying paper. So, just to say it very briefly. So I was a PhD candidate, which means basically you got everything but your dissertation. I'd written two very, well, I don't want to say they were fantastic qualifying papers because I wrote them and it sounds arrogant, but they were innovative. I'll just say that.
You're proud of that.
Yeah. I thought they were very good. But anyway, so there's one time I get called into by the department head and my advisor. I'm like, ooh, what is this about? I'm sure they're going to give me a ribbon because of all the great things I've done. And they basically said, well, we went through your qualifying paper with a fine-tooth comb, and we don't feel you cited this example correctly. I think you put it at 42A, or you put it at the end of the block of 42. It should have been on 42A. I don't think you got 42B from this original source. All this kind of stuff. This is like totally, inconsequential stuff. But because of this, they decided, well, you know what? We're going to have to revoke your PhD candidacy status, right? And at this point, this was like such a bizarre, they're not like accusing me of like, fraud or anything like that. It's basically like punctuation problems, the equivalent, right? And I fixed it actually that day, but I was extremely upset. This was like after I decided to leave, right? And so... what was I going to say? But like the eventually, and they also called me back. I didn't go to classes for like 2 weeks after that because I was like steaming. No, I mean, I don't really get angry about things, but I'm like, why do I even bother?
Yeah.
But eventually they called me back and said, well, actually, we looked at the rules. We can't actually do that. So I guess you're still a PhD candidate, which is, that's how they work. You know what I mean? Like that's not what it is. But I'm just very thankful that stuff like that happened, right? Because that is the kind of thing when you feel the walls closing in like, again, a corrupt system, like it clears things up for you.
Because there's so many people who basically right now are living like a fairly cushy life. Maybe they're a software engineer or something. Yeah. They're like making good money, but they're an academic and
right.
Whatever, making good money, have some status or whatever, but they feel really unhappy. They feel like, they know that there is probably a better, more wholesome life out there for them if they were to try it, right. But they can't make that leap. So what do you think is holding most people back from like taking chances to pursue a more independent, wholesome life?
Well, firstly, most people are going to be taking a pay cut. It might not actually be a real, like in adjusted terms, a real pay cut. Like it might just be like you're making less, but you're also paying less.